The moment we wear it, our spirits lift. It helps us grow strong in body and in mind. As we wear it, we learn patience and respect. The belt system motivates students to strive harder and continue growing. This uniform shapes movement into grace and turns performance into something thrilling. Now, embraced around the world, Taekwondo shares our culture, philosophy, and values with pride and spirit. Though it may seem simple, this uniform holds your passion and your journey. It belongs to Taekwondo. Wear the extraordinary. Be with Taekwondo.
The nation marks 1 year since former President Yoon Suk-yeol briefly declared martial law. A civic group-led rally is underway to commemorate the night the order was made. Calling it the Day of People's Sovereignty, President Lee Jae-myung pledged to designate December 3rd as a public holiday to commemorate how the nation overcame the political turmoil. The South Korean leader also met with the foreign media on Wednesday, saying that securing U.S. consent for nuclear-powered submarines was the major achievement of his two recent summit talks with U.S. President Donald Trump.
자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해 비상 계엄을 선포합니다.
국민 여러분, 지금 국회로 와 주십시오.
계엄 해제 요구 결의안을 상정합니다. 가결되었음을 선포합니다.
싫어. 탄핵하라.
충원 피청구의 대통령 윤석열을 파면합니다.
대통령 이재명.
It's been 1 year since South Korea turned into a political chaos following former President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law. And tonight, over at the National Assembly, a rally is being held to mark 1 year of overcoming the turmoil. We now go live to our political correspondent Moon Hae-ryun, who is standing by with more. It's good to see you, Hae-ryun. Now, what's happening there tonight at the National Assembly?
Good evening, Tammy. The big headline here tonight is the big rally being held outside the National Assembly, as you can probably tell from the big crowd gathered behind me. Now, the atmosphere here is full of energy, with people gathered here to reflect on the events of a year ago. People began to gather outside the National Assembly for hours, well before the official 7 p.m. start time. Colorful banners, waving flags and light sticks are lighting up the streets tonight. Food trucks from various civic groups are handing out food to those who've come, and K-pop music has been blasting from the speakers, reminiscent of the protests that erupted after the martial law declaration last year, while a series of speeches has been delivered under the banner Civil March to End Insurrection and External Subversion and Advance Major Social Reform. Here's what some of the people in the crowd had to say.
The weather suddenly got so cold, but I came out here with the hopes of ending the insurrection soon.
It feels like time has flown by. Some issues have been resolved, while others remain, but as a citizen, I will continue to work hard to address even those that haven't been resolved.
The program here is set to continue well into the night, but that's all I have for now, so back to you, Tammy.
All right, Hae-ryun, thanks for the coverage tonight. Now, on this day, marking the first anniversary of former President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration, President Lee Jae-myung has proposed designating it as a special holiday, expressing gratitude to the people for their efforts. Our senior presidential office correspondent Yoon Jang-min reports.
Exactly 1 year after the martial law declaration, President Lee Jae-myung praised the Korean people's peaceful efforts to block military rule while condemning the incident itself, calling both the attempted coup and the civic resistance unprecedented in a 21st century democracy.
역설적이게도 지난 12.3 쿠데타는 우리 국민들의 높은 주권의식과 대한민국 민주주의의 놀라운 회복력을 세계 만방에 알린 계기가 됐습니다.
President Lee on Wednesday issued a special statement, first anniversary of the Revolution of Light. He proposed designating December 3rd as a day of people's sovereignty and making it an official public holiday, expressing gratitude to citizens who stood unarmed against martial law forces and tanks on the night martial law was declared. He added that the Korean people fully deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for their actions.
온 세계에 민주주의의 위대함을 알린 공로로 노벨 평화상을 받는다면 갈등과 분열로 흔들리는 모든 국가들에게 크나큰 전환점이 될 것입니다.
With investigations and trials still underway, Lee reiterated his pledge to ensure that those involved are held accountable, saying they must be judged for attempting to undermine the constitutional order out of private greed and even plotting a war with a foreign entity.
다시는 쿠데타를 꿈조차 꿀 수 없는 나라, 누구도 국민 주권의 빛을 위협할 수 없는 나라를 만들기 위해서라도 정의로운 통합은 필수입니다.
When it comes to establishing a special tribunal to handle insurrection charges, now under discussion at the National Assembly, Lee said he believes lawmakers will make a wise decision. He gave a similar response when questioned about a possible extension of the special counsel probe. The message of democracy and the rule of law carried into a luncheon later in the day, as the president invited 5 key figures, including the National Assembly Speaker and the Supreme Court Chief Justice, to the presidential office. Yoo Jung-min, Arirang News.
And after delivering his special statement, President Lee also held a press conference with international journalists. Now, topping the briefing were diplomatic affairs. And the president singled out the acquisition of a nuclear-powered submarine as a major outcome of Seoul-Washington summit talks. Our top office correspondent, Song Yu-jin, has more.
South Korean President Lee Jae-myung says the most consequential outcome of his 2 summits with U.S. President Donald Trump was Washington's approval for Seoul to build nuclear-powered submarines.
동북아시아의 전략적 중요성, 우리 입장에서도 가질 수 있는 전략적 유연성, 자율성 이런 측면에서 보면 매우 유용한 결과였다고 생각됩니다.
Speaking to members of the foreign press on Wednesday, President Lee again dismissed concerns that pursuing such vessels could undermine the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. He emphasized that South Korea remains fully committed to non-proliferation and that going nuclear would contradict its goal of a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Another area of focus was Seoul's approach to relations with its neighbors. When asked about the escalating tensions between China and Japan, President Lee said taking sides would only make things worse.
한쪽 편을 들기보다는 모두가 함께 공존할 수 있는 길이 무엇인지를 찾도록 하고 또 가능한 영역이 있다면 우리로서도 갈등을 최소화하고 중재 조정할 수 있는 부분이 있다면 그 부분의 역할을 하는 게 더 바람직하겠다 이렇게 생각합니다.
Lee mentioned that he is willing to visit both China and Japan soon to hold talks with President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi to further strengthen bilateral cooperation with each country. Looking at Russia, President Lee acknowledged diplomatic difficulties, citing the war in Ukraine and Moscow's deepening ties with North Korea. Still, he said Seoul will continue efforts to keep communication channels open to improve relations.
대한민국도 러시아에 대한 제재에 참여하고 있습니다. 사실은 상당히 갑갑한 상태가 돼 있죠. 북러 관계가 우리 입장에서 매우 바람직하지 않은 상태로 진전되고 있는 건 사실이죠. 그렇다고 해서 포기할 수는 없습니다.
Regarding North Korea, the president expressed his willingness to formally apologize to the North over newly surfaced allegations that the previous Yoon Suk-yeol administration sent leaflets to the North to heighten tension and thereby justify its martial law declaration, but added that he needed to be cautious as this could ignite ideological conflicts at home. As the year draws to a close, eyes are on how President Lee will navigate an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape in the new year and how he will continue advancing his pragmatic diplomacy centered on the national interest. 송유진, Arirang News.
And with the National Assembly being at the heart of the martial law declaration fiasco last year, our political correspondent An Sung-jin walks us through what happened that day through the account of a witness.
Kim Sun-young is a union member, and December 3rd, 2024 was just another day. Nothing different for him.
When we hold a sit-in here, except for weekends, we basically live here, eating and sleeping in a tent as we continue our protest.
He wrapped up his day around 10 p.m. and was ready to head to sleep when his colleague told him martial law had been declared. In disbelief, Kim was one of the first to witness the initial entry of martial law troops and the clash between the crowd gathered in front of the National Assembly and the police.
To be honest, I'm human too. I was scared and terrified, but as I sat there thinking, I realized this wasn't a moment to run. This was a moment to step out.
From students and teachers to war veterans, Kim said he met all kinds of people, among those who came to protest the martial law declaration. He set up speakers so they could give speeches and make announcements. Though he now no longer remains outside the National Assembly, the day still weighs heavily on his mind.
Back then, everything felt overwhelming, but the year passed so quickly. After watching everything for a year, it's just how incredible the Korean people are.
Former President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law at 10:29 p.m. on December 3rd, 2024, bringing thousands of citizens to the National Assembly demanding the lifting of the declaration. Lawmakers also gathered to pass a motion to cancel the martial law decree, though entrances were already blocked at around 11 p.m. In order to evade police patrol, National Assembly Speaker Woo Won-sik climbed over this 1-meter-high wall, using it to access the entrance to the National Assembly and convene a plenary session. More than 200 armed martial law troops began entering the National Assembly grounds by helicopter and soon clashed with aides and staff inside the building, leading to physical confrontations. Shortly after 1 a.m., all 190 lawmakers present, out of the 300-member total, voted in favor of the motion, which meant that the majority approval enabled them to cancel the martial law decree.
I hereby declare that the resolution calling for the lifting of martial law has passed.
Following the vote, martial law troops began withdrawing from the National Assembly. And a little after 2 a.m., all personnel had pulled out. Former President Yoon then approved the motion to lift martial law in a cabinet meeting and publicly announced the end shortly before 6 a.m. on December 4th. During those 8 hours after martial law was declared until it was lifted, more than 10,000 people gathered, a powerful movement reviving South Koreans' resistance and fight for democracy. For many, the memories of that morning still cast a long shadow. But as the sun rises over the National Assembly, it reminds us that even after the darkest nights, there is still a sense of collective hope. Not only a reminder of what was lost, but what can be rebuilt. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
And the military, whose duty is to protect the lives and safety of the people, once again faced criticism for intervening in politics with the failed martial law attempt. Now, since that night, South Korea's armed forces have been working to reform themselves. For more on this, we have our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung here in the studio. Welcome, Bo-kyung.
Hi, thanks for having me, Tami.
So, Bo-kyung, the martial law incident left deep scars within the military. Now, how are the soldiers coping with the aftermath?
Right, so they've been deeply shaken after the former President Yoon Suk-yeol used the armed forces as a political tool, in declaring the martial law. Public trust in the military has collapsed once again, a particularly painful setback for South Korea's armed forces, given the country's history of military rule. In 1961, then Major General Park Chung-hee staged a coup, declared martial law, and launched a military regime. And even after his assassination in 1979, another military government emerged as nationwide emergency martial law was imposed under Chun Do-hwan. This second military dictatorship lasted until South Korea's democratization in 1987. Because of this traumatic legacy, the South Korean military has spent decades trying to rebuild public trust, efforts that have now been severely undermined. It is not surprising that many junior officers are leaving the service. In the first half of this year alone, a total of 2,869 Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps officers applied for voluntary early discharge, the highest number ever recorded. That figure is more than double the number from the same period 4 years ago. All this comes as their pride in defending the nation has been badly shaken.
Even before the martial law incident, young officers were already leaving because military life was simply too difficult. Constant relocations, frontline duties, limited personal time, low pay, and increasing workloads. It took 20 to 30 years after the military dictatorship era for the armed forces to rebuild themselves as a people's military. But then martial law happened, delivering a major blow to soldiers' sense of pride.
I do have to say it must have been extremely frustrating for the military. Now, amid this fallout, President Lee Jae-myung appointed a civilian as a defense chief to drive reform within the armed forces. Is that correct?
Right. To erase the traces of the martial law, President Lee Jae-myung appointed a 5-term lawmaker as a defense minister, which was An Gyu-baek, becoming the first civilian defense chief in 64 years.
Right.
And in his inauguration speech, he pledged to transform the military into a people's military and work to regain the public's trust.
Starting today, our defense ministry and armed forces will break away from the past, when they were used as tools of martial law, and be reborn as a military of the people, devoted solely to protecting the nation and its citizens.
The new defense minister then carried out a major personnel shakeup in September, replacing all 7 star general posts. And 2 months later, another large-scale reshuffle of general-grade officers was announced, with 20 of 31 major generals promoted to lieutenant general. The expert says it is necessary to punish those directly involved in the martial law declaration, but also stresses the need to ensure stability and fairness in personnel appointments.
Everyone agrees that the small number of people clearly involved in the martial law attempt should be punished. But if the military suddenly changes the balance of people from certain backgrounds or rushes to put people into roles they're not suited for, it becomes very hard for others to accept those decisions.
And to prevent the military from becoming entangled in such unlawful orders, I believe the lawmakers have introduced a bill that will give service members the right to refuse such orders. Tell us more, right?
Right. So this is in line with the government's plan to revise the provisions that require civil servants to follow superiors' commands, even when they could be unlawful or improper. The Defense Ministry, as you mentioned, has backed revisions to the Basic Act of the Service of Military Personnel, seeking to enshrine service members' right to reject unlawful or improper commands. In fact, several officers have already been promoted for refusing to carry out orders on December 3rd. Given that strict obedience to superiors is central to military culture, the legal revision and these promotions have raised concerns both inside and outside the armed forces. Some experts argue that if a disobedience clause is to be introduced, there should at least be a clear distinction between wartime and peacetime, meaning this issue is likely to remain a topic of debate.
That's a very good point. A lot of careful thought will be needed going forward. Bo-kyung, thanks for coming in tonight.
Thank you.
Now, in the months following the night of martial law, Korea's diplomatic capacity was restrained due to the uncertainty over Yoon's impeachment. However, the past year has shown Korea's democratic and diplomatic resilience, according to one international observer. Our Oh Soo-young tells us more.
A year after the martial law crisis unsettled South Koreans and foreign observers, the country's diplomatic standing has been restored by democratic resilience and top-level diplomacy. That's according to former EU ambassador to South Korea, Michael Reiterer, who was in Seoul on the night the December 3rd decree was declared. He recalls the disbelief that swept through diplomatic circles as events unfolded.
I think I shared probably at the beginning the feeling with the international community that cannot be. This is not true. That was also the reaction of some Koreans around me at that evening.
Initial shock quickly evolved into deeper evaluation of what the crisis revealed. He cited warning signs within the previous administration and long-standing vulnerabilities in Korea's political architecture.
If you look at this night, probably without civil society and with parliamentarians jumping over the fence and military not really engaging, the whole thing could have turned completely different. So how is it possible that this declaration could have happened?
Korea's democratic resilience, he noted, has long rested on the strength of its civic mobilization, which he observed over 2 presidential impeachment crises.
Well, I think the Korean history is actually a very strong argument because the engagement of civil society in Korea is probably stronger than in other countries. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes. 2017, I have seen it last year when I was in Korea and when I saw demonstrations against President Yoon at the time. So I think the pressure from the street is a corrective.
But he warned that relying on the public alone to prevent such crises is insufficient. Reiterer pointed to renewed discussions on constitutional reform to prevent a deadlock between the president and the executive.
And I think the lesson to be learned is that there should be something done about the presidential term, and perhaps also to make sure that the parliament and the president somehow are elected in parallel. Because one of the reasons for this coup efforts were the frustration that the president was blocked by the parliament.
Still, he noted that the world now sees Korea as having passed a significant stress test. At a time when Seoul is seeking a greater role in global affairs, from supply chain resilience to outreach to the global south, its swift return to high-level diplomacy after the crisis helped restore confidence abroad.
The international community, I think, has accepted now that Korea is back and back on track. We have seen that President Lee could host the APEC summit. He traveled to the United States. He stopped over in Tokyo. I think there is now a sound basis. And you also have a foreign minister now, Jo Yoon, who has a long experience as a diplomat. And I think he can certainly make sure that the ship remains on course, even if there are some waves on the ocean.
With Korea seeking greater influence from G7 level engagement to semiconductor supply chain leadership, Reuters stresses that foreign policy cannot be separated from internal cohesion.
The country has to unite and stay together because there are big challenges to meet. And if foreign policy starts at home, then you have to be consolidated at home. And I think, therefore, Korea would have an interest to have a more cooperative domestic environment in order to be stronger internationally.
1 year on, Korea's partners believe the country's democratic foundations remain intact, but its foreign policy role will grow only as steadily as the institutions that support it. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
A revised report by the central bank reveals the Korean economy saw a stronger expansion of 1.3% in the third quarter of this year, and a clear indication of a steady momentum despite external risk factors. Park Jun-han reports.
According to the Bank of Korea on Wednesday, South Korea recorded its strongest quarter-on-quarter GDP growth in 3 years and 9 months in the third quarter, expanding by 1.3%. This is the highest quarterly growth since the fourth quarter of 2021, when the country's GDP rose by 1.6%. The figure was revised up from the previous estimate of 1.2%, thanks to stronger than expected domestic demand and net exports.
The contribution of domestic demand to growth expanded significantly in the third quarter. Private consumption also made a much larger positive contribution, while government consumption remained at the same level as the previous quarter.
South Korea's growth rate came in at 1.2% in the first quarter of 2024, but fell sharply, contracting 0.2% for the second quarter. It then inched up to 0.1% in both the third and fourth quarters, before slipping back to minus 0.2% in the first quarter of 2025. The country's economy rebounded to 0.7% in the second quarter and continued its strong upward momentum into the third quarter. The Bank of Korea said that if the fourth quarter GDP stays above zero growth from the third quarter, achieving an annual growth rate of 1.1%, which is higher than the original 1% projection, is still plausible.
If fourth quarter growth comes in between minus 0.4% and minus 0.1%, the economy can still achieve 1% annual growth. And if growth stays at zero or above, an annual rate of 1.1% is also mathematically possible.
Despite the strong GDP growth, the income that actually flows into Korean households and businesses didn't rise as much. Real gross national income rose 0.8%, but nominal gross national income slipped 0.3%, as Korea earned less for its exports while paying for more imports, reducing the purchasing power of each export dollar. Park Jun-han, Arirang News.
South Korea has approved its first defense budget under the Lee Jae-myung administration, featuring the sharpest increase in 5 years as Seoul moves to bolster its self-defense capabilities. The Ministry of National Defense on Wednesday announced an approved budget of 65.8 trillion won, or roughly $44.8 billion US. This marks the largest increase since 2019. Now, the expanded budget will support South Korea's autonomous defense capabilities, centered on the so-called three-axis system, the country's framework for countering North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. Funding for these programs will rise from about $5 billion to roughly $6 billion US. Additional investments include AI-based defense solutions, mass production of the KF-21 fighter jet, and upgrades to other strategic assets. Defense R&D will climb to $4 billion. That's up to 20% with a new funding for a defense space certification center and enhanced satellite capabilities.
It's the coldest day of this winter. The temperatures remain below zero even during the day today. Cold wave advisories have been issued in center areas, northern parts of Gangwon-do, Gyeongsang-buk-do, and Chungcheong-buk-do provinces. Heavy snow is forecast around the west coast regions in this freezing air. Heavy snow advisories have been issued on the west coast of Chungcheongnam-do province, the Jeollado provinces, and the mountainous areas of Jeju Island. The west coast areas and the mountainous areas of Jeju Island will receive up to 10 centimeters of snow by tomorrow morning. It will be freezing tomorrow morning nationwide with Seoul at -9 degrees and Chuncheon at -14 degrees. Daily highs will rise not too much, up to 3 degrees in Seoul, 8 degrees in Busan. The first snow of this season is forecast tomorrow. And that's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
Korea, a globally recognized sports powerhouse. Behind the dazzling achievements, there's always an invisible force at work. With sophisticated materials, cutting-edge equipment, and innovative technological solutions, SMEs in the K-sports industry play a vital role in bolstering Korea's status as a sports powerhouse. By integrating AI technology, they unlock athletes' potential and enhance performance, elevating the sports environment to the next level and opening new markets in the sports industry. Their innovative technology and bold challenges drive the growth of Korea's sports industry, creating a better world through sports. The innovation of these SMEs never stops. A systematic partnership support program is implemented to discover promising sports SMEs, provide technical validation and R&D support to enhance competitiveness, and strengthen the foundation for overseas expansion. At Tokyo Sportech 2025, the technological prowess of Korean companies was recognized. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, and the Korea Sports Promotion Foundation supported K-Sports companies with product promotion and business consultations with global buyers, demonstrating product quality and market potential, and confirming the possibility of expanding into the global market.
저희는 ICT 강국으로서 그 바이어나 사용자들한테 신기술을 접목한 생활 스포츠 기회를 실질적으로 확대할 수 있는 그 기회를 제공하는데 많은 도움이 될 수 있으리라고 확신을 합니다.
이제 스포츠도 K죠. K 스포츠는 이겁니다.
The joy for all, created by the power of K-Sports. Experience the future of the new sports industry through the innovation and technology of the Korean sports industry.
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Poli Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pinkfong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like a total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imagination. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. Exactly 1 year ago today, on December 3rd, martial law was declared in South Korea. It was a moment that pushed the nation's democracy to the edge. But in a special address this morning, President Lee Jae-myung called it a turning point that showed the world Korea's democratic power. He praised the people's nonviolent resistance as historic, saying they've shown the kind of leadership that deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. But while celebrating that, he also called the revolution of light, and President Lee made clear that the revolution is not over. Trials are still underway, and justice, he said, must come before forgiveness. So what has Korea truly gained, and what must still be faced? For a deeper discussion on this, we are joined in the studio by two experts. Hans Schadl, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University to my right. Thank you, Professor, for coming.
Thank you for having me, Mo-kyun. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. And also to my left, we have attorney Kim Ji-soo. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me again.
So let's start our discussion with Professor Shuttle, a recap of the past year. Let's begin with that. So since the declaration of the martial law, how much progress do you think has Korea's democracy made since then? And also, how would you assess the overall resilience of Korea's democratic system?
Right. I think resilience is such an important frame, Mok-yeon, to look at the past year. And we can look at resilience through political institutions and also through political culture. And in terms of the governing institutions, I think that the system really did work. The assembly followed through with impeachment. The courts followed through with removal from power. Former President Yoon Suk-yeol left office. And then we turn to the political culture. It was the people, as has been remembered all day today, and I think is being commemorated this evening with citizens' rallies and marches in Yeouido, even at this hour. The people turned out to defend their democracy when it was attacked seemingly out of nowhere by a president ready to go rogue. And the public continued to show up for protests day after day, and the elections went forward despite a lot of ongoing polarization in the society, and I think we can talk about that. The elections went forward, the results were accepted. The current president, Lee Jae-myung, now enjoys a fairly high approval rating, consistently above 50%, sometimes even approaching 60% in the first several months. That's not something to take for granted in a society that has a lot of contentious issues to deal with. And I would say also on the question of polarization, I was reading a public opinion poll earlier this week that pointed out that 77% of the public is worried about the degree that people see themselves as too much at odds in the society, that polarization as in people just seeing themselves not as unified, as fundamentally divided on insurmountable issues. I think the fact that 77% of the public is worried about polarization in the first place sounds not so good, but actually I take it more hopefully. I take it as a sign that the concern on that issue also suggests a willingness to find ways to deal with it. And I think that's where all sides in the country's political world really need to go.
That's an important way to look at it. We'll go back to the polarization aspect as we speak. But before that, Professor, in a special address this morning, President Lee Jae-myung called the past year as a historic moment of democratic power. And he also said that even, Koreans actually deserve the Nobel Peace Prize as well. Do you think that message actually will help to shape global conception about Korea's democracy?
Right. I mean, who knows what the Nobel Committee will do every year? It's always a surprise when they issue the awards. But I would say one thing that's very clear is the rallies the people held were peaceful. I mean, we all remember images of that cold night in December 3rd where soldiers had been dispatched to the assembly. We're not totally sure yet what they were going to have to do. I think they had some orders, but they were unsure about following them, as it seems it turned out. And we saw videos of ajumas and ajoshis, aunts and uncles, middle-aged men and women running up to these soldiers and yelling at them and telling them to lay off and back off. I think there was even one viral photo of a woman approaching a soldier who was armed and basically staring him down. So even though the protests were confrontational, they were confronting an abuse of power, and they were ultimately peaceful. When we think about the K-pop concert light sticks that were at many of the rallies that followed that first night. And there's story after story. In fact, I think President Lee mentioned it in his speech today, that the people stood up for their democracy at a very critical moment. I mean, I was home when I heard the news of the martial law declaration late at night. And I would say for the first hour or so, as I was just digesting this, I mean, there had been some indicators that the president was thinking of doing something extreme, but I don't think anybody expected it when it happened so suddenly. And for that hour or so, I felt a bit like I was in a mousetrap, teaching political science in a country that's going under martial law. What does that mean? But I just kept thinking, well, the next day I'm going to go to school and teach normally, and I'm just carrying on business as usual until that's disrupted. But then I was heartened so quickly after that to hear about how the citizenry was indeed turning up at the assembly, and even Lee Jae-myung himself, who was in the assembly at the time, jumping over, walls and gates to get in. And there's a lot of metaphor to that too. I mean, anytime we talk about walls being erected and then walls being overcome, and they can be walls of any kind, and that's something certainly that the assembly members did to defend their institution. So that was really the beginning, I think, that one night, of the institution of the assembly setting the tone for the rest of the country's constitutional democracy to prevail, with the people out there again peacefully protesting to defend it. And that is something that I think publics the world over take note. There are several countries, Brazil would be another example, where authoritarian power grabs have been fought off by citizenries and institutions. So Korea joins those ranks with this incident, as painful as it was at the time.
Right, so it was definitely a very shocking incident that shed light on the power of democracy, especially among the citizens in Korea. Now, let's also shed light to the legal front, attorney. The martial law trial seems to be wrapping up. Could you remind us of our viewers, where does the case of former President Yoon Suk-yeol actually stand right now?
So actually, our former President Yoon is confronting two separate trials. And one is the sedition case, where he's charged as the ringleader of an attempted insurrection. And I probably think this is the most famous trial that is going on. The case is being held by Seoul Central District Court's Criminal Division 25, presided over by Judge Ji Gi-yeon. And the other case, handled by Criminal Division 35 under Judge Baek Dae-hyun, deals with allegations that he abused his authority by pressuring military officials to take part in this illegal mobilization plan. But I guess the sedition trial is the main one in this question, and the court has recently set a very clear schedule for the final wrap-ups. They announced that the last three hearings, January 5th, 7th and 9th, will be the closing arguments, and January 9th will effectively wrap up the trial. And normally in Korea, the verdict comes out about a month later after the closing arguments, since the judge needs time to write the concrete judgment documentations after the argument is over. So realistically, we're looking around mid-February or early spring verdict for the first instance decision.
Right, so we're really getting close to the verdict. Now, looking at the case itself, the trial itself, attorney, what have been the main points of contention in the sedition case, and also what should the court actually be paying closest attention to?
Well, since this incident has been shocking, and also it requires a lot of legal going through the papers. So there are a lot of contentions right here, but I'm just going to point out three main key points. So first, it was about premeditation, whether there were discussed early drafts or early meetings before the December 3rd regarding the declaration of martial law. And if pre-planning has been proven, it is a definite, strong legal evidence that supports the sedition charge. And this issue is at the center of the military trial where defendant Kim Yong-hyun is taking place. And second key point is whether they were an attempt to neutralize the National Assembly. So the court is pressing hard on troop movement plans, on whether there was a real intention in order to neutralize National Assembly by preventing our congressmen to go into the meeting itself. And this has been examined most deeply in police-related trial, which is defended by Cho Jin-ho. And lastly, not but least, the act of targeting the National Election Commission. So currently, the defendant Kim Yong-hyun is strongly saying that there has been a rigged election. So that was the reason why they had troops into the election commission. However, that allegation is valid for right now. And so to the question on which element seems to be drawing the most attention from the bench, I definitely would say when we look closely at the courtroom, they are looking whether there was a coordinated attempt. So which means that these actors move separately or as part of one coordinated plan. And that broader picture is being handled in the former President Yoon's trials right now. And for just a further context, once the witness examination finalizes, all three trials that are where defendant Kim Yong-hyun, where defendant Cho Jin-ho, and where defendant Yoon is holding, is going to be merged into a single court. And so that it will enable the judges to know whether the allegations is true or not.
And all of this, the verdicts we're expecting in around 3 months.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Attorney. Now, let's zoom out a little bit again, Professor, and consider the broader political climate. We've touched upon, the polarization of the public in South Korea. Could you elaborate for us, explain for us deeper, like what is actually bringing this deep divide?
Right. What are some underlying factors here? When you have a population, say, of 50 million people, and there are differing versions of the truth, or differing fundamental concerns of the public, where do they come from? And I think one factor, not only in Korea, but in many democracies around the world right now, would be the changes we've seen in media ecosystems in the high-tech age, where the public doesn't watch the same news broadcasts all together anymore. The public isn't even reading the same set of newspapers. I mean, this is not the only cause, but today, so many of my students get their news primarily from social media platforms. Many older folks, even in this country, are listening more to opinion makers rather than actual news gathering journalists whose work has been vetted by professional editors. So the public ends up with very differing accounts of the truth and different sets of heroes and villains. And this is true right now in my native country, in the U.S. as well. We're struggling with similar patterns of polarization. So I think a lot rides on the capacity of the citizenry to do the work, and also for us to educate the next generations to look at news content critically and seek out very true and fair and valid news content. Beyond that, there are some other factors in this country's political system that can drive polarization. The political institutions here, while resilient, there is a kind of winner-take-all nature to the way power is structured, particularly in the executive and the single-chamber legislative branch. So if you've got the president and the assembly in the control of the same political party, they can get a lot done, but the minority party can become a kind of permanent opposition, and or at least stuck in paralysis for a period of time until they can gain power again, where there's very little they can do. And then the citizens that support that minority party can feel as if they have no voice in the government. So that too can be a problem, I think. And the country also has a very strong presidency, in which power, in some ways that's good, things can get done, but it also means that power is not necessarily distributed. So there's pros and cons with a political system where the power is concentrated, where the power might be dispersed a little bit and more widely shared. There are ways to rethink the way the executive and legislative branches could distribute power, and some of those factors could be thought about in the months and years ahead too.
A very important point. Professor has just highlighted the importance of distribution of power. Now, speaking of which, there are also calls for a constitutional reform in the country. Attorney Kim, the 4-year presidential term, we're actually talking about this lately, and one re-election that's going to be allowed. Do you think that could actually really help reduce polarization in the nation?
So before we delve into the question, I also noticed that a lot of people are intrigued by the notion of reformation of Constitution. And I do know that the agenda of these 4-year and 2-term presidency is to relieve the president-focused power, so to decentralize that power. So I definitely understand why these interests are coming from. However, I think before we think of these solutions, we need to dig deeper into the root of polarization. And I personally think that it mainly comes from a winner-takes-all political culture, as our professor mentioned it before, and also from a presidency that holds too much centralized authority compared to other nations. And I think that is a fundamental problem that we have in regarding presidency. So I think the focus should be on rebalancing power itself, not just adjusting the terms or the years by itself. So the real question is how much power should stay with one president and how much it must be shared, checked, or limited or regulated by other institutions. And I personally think the timing is perfect for this kind of discussion because in the past, constitutional reform kept failed because the reformation was driven by party interests. But after the December 3rd crisis, I think people now see a more deeper structural problem regarding president institutions. And so this makes, I think, is a genuine opportunity for us to approach to a more meaningful institutional reform.
Right, definitely. So these kinds of efforts would be definitely necessary moving forward. But as of now, we've seen a year pass since the martial law declaration, and the crisis has been done. Now, so as of now, Professor, what kind of challenges do you think still remains, and what kind of challenges still exist in building a stronger democracy for South Korea?
Well, I think with the institutions that we currently have, working with what the country is going to live with, I think somehow the various parties, of course the two main parties, but even the smaller parties as well, need to try to find some common ground on some key issues that matter a lot to the people. I always like to point out, especially at election time, and I'll repeat it now, that when we look at what the different parties talk about when elections roll around, when it comes to the education system or the cost of housing or the quality of life or opportunities for small or medium-sized businesses or dealing with youth underemployment, real problem for young adults today, or of course the population crisis. Recently it seems that we may be starting another resurgence in new babies being born, which is very good news. That's like one step forward, it seems, for the society. But how do you create the conditions that make it more affordable and appealing for families to live here? I think the public's really hungry to see a political establishment that becomes more responsive to these kinds of concerns. So one thing that the various political parties can do is try to come up with some consensus on these kinds of issues that have to do with social welfare, economic well-being, maybe shorten the work week. I think the two parties are not too far on those issues, where say the DP and the PPP can come together and show the country a win-win. Now that may be hard to do when the PPP, much of it, is still supporting former President Yoon. There are some members of the PPP today, actually, not a large number, about 24 of them, I think 25, that apologized for the martial law fiasco. That's a baby step forward, at least, for the PPP to try to start to rehabilitate itself, and for that cohort of lawmakers to start to work with other political parties. Ultimately, politics in a democracy does not always yield perfection. But the idea is to come up with policy solutions and laws and reforms that the country and its people can live with and go forward productively. And I think that's a general prescription for any country trying to come out of a rough patch, especially when it comes to polarization.
And as you said, a big approach would be to listen to the public, what they really want, to their voices.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, before we let you go, President Lee has also emphasized national unity and popular sovereignty. And today, he also called for what he described as a just unity. Attorney, what kind of steps do you think are needed to actually turn that message into real, lasting national unity?
Okay, so before I came here, I actually went back and reviewed President Lee's 21st presidential election pledge book, and I found some agendas where he actually pointed out what kind of things we need to do in order to have our nations unified and in order to relieve any kind of polarization from the results of elections. And his agendas were as follows. First, ending cycles of political retaliation, of course. And secondly, strengthening direct democracy. And lastly, introducing a recall system for lawmakers. So before I delve into the main part, I would like to briefly mention about the agendas that he talked about on the aspects of lawyers. So the recall systems or any kind of mechanisms that brings citizens into a direct participation is very idealistic, and it is a good conceptualization. However, in practical norm, it kind of seems unrealistic because it needs a lot of reformations, a lot of lawmaking process are needed. However, I do wanted to present them because it is a kind of a path that we need to step forward to. So President Lee definitely has provided a a lot of mechanisms that citizens can actually participate. For example, the recall system is where citizens can actually vote to remove elected offices from its office. And also he talked about a lot of citizens' assembly, national sovereignty committees, and even a citizen-led constitutional initiatives. And those are quite very progressive forms, I would say. However, I think all these kind of policies are really good. However, one fundamental thing should be considered is the fact that there needs to be a clear and responsible ground in sharing information before we start this kind of policy to be initiated. Because I think a lot of polarization and a lot of disputes happening in Korea right now has been derived from a lot of news that has been that led people to be polarized, that I would say false news or manipulative news that drives people to fight to each other. So I think we need a healthier community, or we need more stronger ethical legal duties for new organizations before we delve into such kind of progressive matters.
A strong, very strong message that we could end our discussion on tonight. Thank you so much for your insights, Attorney Kim.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Shuttle, we really appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you, Mokyum. Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.